Hello there, this is James S. Croft, the Days 1978, and recently I was commissioned to discuss the short film Carnage, directed by Simon Amstell and links down at Underbar, a movie which is presented as a documentary made in the year 2067, documenting the decades-long social evolution which has brought veganism to the brink of being mainstream in the present day, and in the future, at least according to the film, creates a society in which exploiting animals and consuming their flesh, milk and ovulations is so reprehensible that older people born after the year 2000, who were the last generation to be raised as carnists as they came to be known, since veganism has become the norm and thus they had become the fringe minority, are so traumatised by the guilt of their atrocities that they need to undergo therapy. However, before we get into the meat of the issue, the first thing that I want to mention is that the introduction to this film opens with a genuinely beautiful shot of a white man, an Afro-Caribbean woman, and a South Asian man walking together while holding hands, presumably because they're in a loving polyamorous relationship, and how much this fills me with joy. First of all, because it gives me hope for the future. Secondly, because, as I'll explain at the end of this video, it's a wonderful example of how social evolution is intersectional. And thirdly, because I know that the mere sight of this will have caused thousands, if not millions of people to switch off and complain to the BBC with the white-hot fury of 1,000 suns before the narrator even mentioned veganism. Not because there is anything actually wrong with such a relationship on anything approaching an objective level, but because any perceived threat to the social norm which undermines our value structure and thus our very identity, and which therefore, on top of making us feel threatened and uncomfortable, we fear will result in us being declared to be the bad guy, girl or other, merely for doing and believing what was always normal in the past, inevitably provokes a backlash, or to be more accurate, a frontlash, screaming that the change that is coming will doom all of humanity and be worse than we can possibly imagine, in the futile hopes of turning back the tide, resulting in Him Too, Comicsgate, Make America Great Again, Build the Wall, and so on and so forth. Be sure to bear this in mind, of course, because that's ultimately the entire sodding point. And the second thing that I want to make clear for the sake of full disclosure is that I myself am trying and ultimately failing to become vegan, have long since stopped eating almost all red meat and cheese, and have recently switched to soy milk, thus making me a leftist cuck mangina soy boy.
So come.
However, the key defining point which links my personal struggle to any discussion of the issues raised in that short film is that I'm not attempting to become vegan because I feel overwhelming compassion for animals, but primarily for environmental and health reasons. And this is a key distinction because, as the film suggests, although I know on a rational intellectual level that exploiting and killing other beings which are capable of feeling pain and distress for food is unnecessary and cruel, my selective empathy is probably the reason why I'm struggling to give up chicken and fish, when if I genuinely believed that meat is murder, then giving them up would be as much of a struggle as choosing not to kill another human being. But as it stands though, because everyone's compassion and empathy are selective well beyond the point of hypocrisy, and more importantly, because I live in a world in which eating meat, fish and dairy products is still the social norm, I just don't feel the same sympathy, which doesn't so much compel people to go vegan per se, as much as it makes it the default option, because when you feel equal sympathy for each of these animals, eating a cow, a pig, a sheep or a chicken is as reprehensible for almost everyone outside of China, Taiwan and Korea as eating a dog. Indeed, a prime example of the hypocrisy that is the selectiveness of our empathy and compassion is the fact that unless they were raised in a culture where it is also the social norm, the very same people who condemn veganism because insert stock argument here would call the police as soon as they'd finished dry heaving if they were ever offered a meal of roast dog. And as a matter of fact, in his short film Carnage, Simon Amstell makes a point of calling out the ludicrous absurdity that was the movie Babe having a Happy Meal tie-in with McDonald's, because children in 1995 felt so much sympathy and love for a fictional pig that they were eager to collect toys that came free with butchered and cooked cows and chickens. However, on the flip side of that coin, it's important to note that in the most extreme fringe cases, so-called animal rights activists, so-called for the reason that I'll explain in a moment, are willing to murder other human beings in order to advance their own agenda. And just in case I haven't enraged enough people already, the anti-abortion movement, which laughably describes itself as the pro-life movement, is guilty of exactly the same kind of hypocrisy, although admittedly to a much greater degree, declaring that killing of fetuses is murder, killing people who kill fetuses because murder is wrong, and then either rationalising their hypocrisy or simply ignoring it altogether. Because in the end, the entire point here, the fundamental basis of both the so-called animal rights and pro-life movements, which make them comparable in spite of the fundamental distinction between them, which I'll address in a moment, is that unless and until an animal or a human fetus starts protesting the issue themselves, proclaiming that they have the right to live and or to not be exploited, while the activists and counter-activists in question always talk about rights, in inverted commas, the only issue at hand is what they personally feel to be wrong. After all, rights must be proclaimed by the individual or group in question, because without that underlying foundation, without that lodestar guiding their development, we are literally just making up rules and then changing them whenever we feel like it, and while we argue about whether animals can think or feel much as we do, or whether fetuses are babies or have souls, the bottom line is that we are the ones doing the arguing. That when all is said and done, the only issue is how far we allow ourselves, and if we are the majority who shape society, allow others to go. Not because the other party proclaims their right to live freely without being exploited and or murdered, but dependent entirely upon how we feel, meaning that ultimately, exploiting and or killing animals, consuming their flesh, milk and ovulations, and terminating human fetuses in utero are only wrong if we declare them to be wrong. And like the difference that makes no difference between eating a chicken, cow or fish and eating a dog or a giraffe, we usually only declare it to be wrong if it makes us feel bad enough for us to draw the line ourselves. As a matter of fact, while many people, particularly anti-abortion activists, will condemn the hypocrisy of society becoming increasingly permissive of abortion, while becoming increasingly damning of carnism, condemning one quote-unquote genocide while enabling another, at the end of the day, as I've been pointing out for years now, the root basis of all morality and thus of the social norms and attitudes which shape our identity and our values is nothing but the whims of the majority, determined entirely by our emotions, meaning that they change as society changes. That ultimately the reason why abortion is becoming increasingly accepted while carnism is becoming increasingly condemned is because the hierarchical society in which women and animals were inherently inferior and thus property which existed solely to be exploited is being replaced by the long slow crawl towards social justice. That in short, while the so-called pro-life movement is merely another facet of the last desperate gasp of the white supremacist neoliberal cishet patriarchy which decrees that women must be wives and mothers, or if they have to do any form of paid work, nannies, dinner ladies, nurses and teachers, because that is their place in the natural order of things. The fact that more and more young people are becoming vegan is part of the wider social evolution which causes younger people to be inevitably less bigoted and discriminatory and more sceptical of capitalism and the social order in general than their parents' generation, with Simon Amstell's film not declaring that the entire nation will miraculously become vegan overnight, but instead correctly predicting that it will be a drawn-out and often painful process which countless people will resist for decades, but on the other hand will be spurred on by catastrophes such as mass flooding and the outbreak of at least one epidemic, both of which will have been at the very least exacerbated by unsustainably intense animal farming practices, with society eventually being forced to realise that society itself is the problem. Meaning that, as the film itself points out, far beyond token gestures such as eating free-range meat and mackerel instead of cod because you don't want to be judged at your next suburban middle-class dinner party for eating the same food as stupid, obese and inferior poor people, we all have to tear down the existing hierarchy and replace it with a more just and equal world. And indeed, while it only ever touched upon them in passing for obvious reasons, the most intriguing parts of the film for me personally were when it discussed the intersections of veganism with issues such as neoliberalism, climate change, and even feminism, predicting the development of a fifth wave of feminism while never actually indicating what the fourth wave would be, which, for example, condemned the raping of cows in order to force them to produce milk, which is then processed and marketed through the hypersexualization and objectification of women, and then in turn, how the film also depicted the inevitable social frontlash, going back to what I said earlier, of insecure white boys and their token supporters against the oppression and tyranny of veganism, performing exactly the same pitiful and endlessly repeated dance as the insecure white boys and their token supporters of today, whining about quote-unquote false rape, sexual assault and sexual harassment allegations, insisting that Black Lives Matter are the real racists, Antifa are the real fascists, and on and on and on, only to a different tune. Because as Naomi Klein points out in her book This Changes Everything, Capitalism versus the Climate, while they invariably get all of the details wrong in their defensive panic and outrage, perceiving and thus portraying it as a vast evil and child-raping conspiracy that is worse than Stalin, Hitler, Pol Pot and Jimmy Savile put together, regressive and reactionary white boys and their token supporters are correct in the fact that unlike many self-proclaimed progressives and liberals who, for example, demand that everyone stop calling white men racist and shut up about feminism because it hurts their delicate white boy feelings. Sorry, I mean because the economy or climate change are the priority. They recognise that such issues are inevitably intersectional, thus going out of their way to condemn feminism, social justice and human rights just as viciously as they condemn socialism, environmentalism and immigration.
PragerU's boast of only needing 5 minutes to convey its ideas to you is actually being a little too generous there. I can tell you basically everything PragerU has to offer in a fraction of that time, so here goes. Firstly, feminism and other social justice causes are completely unnecessary, right up until the point at which we all agree they did something necessary, in which case the credit should go instead to Christian white men for allowing it to happen. Secondly, capitalism is great and has absolutely no downsides, brackets, except for all the downsides, which are actually the result of us not doing capitalism hard enough. Thirdly, no, that's about it really. What did that take? 30 seconds?
Because no matter how subconsciously they may do so, regressive and reactionary white boys, along with their token supporters, understand that tackling climate change, or if you still refuse to believe that climate change exists and or is caused by human action, the destruction of the planet, including massive deforestation, making the air literally unbreathable, and overfishing and polluting the oceans to extinction while filling them with plastic, does inevitably mean the total abolishment and replacement of the white supremacist neoliberal cishet patriarchy, no matter how counterintuitive that may seem. That the struggle for equality, rights, inclusion, representation and social justice in general are part and parcel of the fight against environmental destruction and economic inequality, because from crying that Doctor Who casting a woman in the lead role defies the social norm, to billionaires and corporations buying up and controlling most of the media and all right-wing political parties across the globe for the express purpose of preserving the social norm, in which by sheer coincidence they just happen to have almost all of the money and power, it is the social norm that is the problem. Meaning that while no strawman builders, it is not a solution in and of itself, and I'm not claiming that it is, the solution to issues such as economic inequality and climate change inevitably includes creating a world in which an Afro-Caribbean woman, a South Asian man, and a white man are free to openly hold hands in public without fear of judgment or condemnation, while at the same time eating a chicken is as horrendous and inconceivable as actually eating a human baby, because to quote Kumi Naidu, the new Secretary General of Amnesty International, the patterns of oppression that we are living through are interconnected. You cannot talk about climate change without recognising that it is also an inequality and race issue. You can't address sexual discrimination without recognising that it's bound up in the economic exclusion of women, and you can't ignore the fact that people's civil and political rights are often suppressed exactly when they're trying to demand basic economic justice. Thanks very much for watching. Do please remember to click on the notification bell and to select all updates in order to at least increase the possibility that you'll be informed when I next upload a video. If you'd like to commission a video yourself on any subject within reason, then do please feel free to email me at ujames1978@mail.com, not Gmail or Hotmail, just mail.com. And assuming that your request won't get my channel flagged down, I'm certain that we can negotiate something. Alternatively, the link to my Patreon page is listed down as the underbar, the top tier of which gives you the right to demand a video on any subjects that won't get my channel flagged down every single month. Although needless to say, all pledges, no matter how small, are always greatly appreciated. And speaking of which, if you'd like to bung me a fiver simply to say thank you for being so gosh darn incredible, then the link to my paypal.me button is also linked down as the underbar.
And all the girlies say I'm pretty fly for a white guy.